I remember thinking back then that this job was just a placeholder, a way to pay the rent until something real came along. Cleaning up the hallowed halls of St. Augustine's Preparatory wasn't exactly my calling. Scrubbing marble floors, polishing ancient pews, emptying bins filled with discarded catechism handouts. It was mundane, sure, but the pay was decent, and the hours were late, which suited my nocturnal tendencies. I wasn't there for salvation. I was there for the paycheck. The sanctity of the place meant nothing to me. It was just a building, albeit one steeped in an almost suffocating aura of old beliefs, the kind that tasted of dust and forgotten incantations. It was during my second week, deep in the silent hours between 2 and 3 a.m., that I found it. I was in the sacristy, preparing my tools for the chapel, and my hands wrapped around the wooden handle of my industrial mop. My fingers brushed against something rough, something alien to the smooth, worn wood. I tilted it under the dim utility light, squinting. Scratched, not with a pen or even a sharpie, but deeply incised, as if with a nail or a shard of glass, were words I knew I hadn't put there. My stomach dropped a little, a flutter of unease. My own name wasn't even on the handle. Do not look into the chapel mirrors after midnight. The words were unsettlingly precise, stark against the grain. My first thought was prank. Some mischievous student, perhaps, leaving behind a cryptic warning. But these weren't a child's scrawl. The letters were angular, almost calligraphic in their deliberate precision, a script that felt ancient, like Latin rendered in a modern hand. And the urgency in their simple command, it pricked at me. Chapel mirrors. There were only two, flanking the altar huge, ornate affairs framed in dark, heavy wood that always seemed to drink the light rather than reflect it. I usually avoided them anyway, catching only fleeting glimpses of my tired reflection. Despite the rational part of my brain screaming, hoax, another, colder part began to hum. This was an old building, after all. Older than the city itself, they said. Whispers of secret passages, hidden archives, relics locked away in Vatican vaults filtered through the idle chatter of the daytime staff. I'd always dismissed it as pious fantasy, the romantic embellishments of people desperate to believe in something more. But now, seeing those words in the dead of night, alone in a place that held so many secrets, I felt a strange pull. A morbid curiosity began to fester, an itch I knew I shouldn't scratch. I should have stopped then. I should have taken the mop, snapped its handle, and walked out the door. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself drawn towards the chapel, the mop handle feeling strangely heavy in my grip, almost like a divining rod. The vast space was plunged into near darkness, save for the emergency lights casting an anemic glow. The air grew perceptibly colder as I stepped through the arched doorway, a chill that had nothing to do with the thermostat. My breath plumed faintly in front of me. The two mirrors loomed, dark rectangles against the distant wall. They weren't reflecting the meager light. They seemed to be absorbing it, portals to a deeper, denser shadow. My heart was pounding a rhythm against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the overwhelming silence. "Do not look," the mop handle commanded. After midnight, it specified. It was 2:17 a.m. My rational mind was still fighting, whispering about fatigue, about the power of suggestion. But my feet kept moving, slow and deliberate, towards the altar, towards those black mirrors. I felt an undeniable urge, a compulsion to test the warning, to peer beyond the veil of common sense. I was so arrogant then, so sure of my own reality. I told myself it was just a reflection, just glass. I stood before the right mirror, my reflection a wavering, ghost-like figure in the dimness. My face was pale, eyes wide with a fear I was still trying to deny. I stared, willing myself to see nothing, to prove it was all a ridiculous joke. For a long moment, there was nothing but my own terrified gaze. And then, at the very edge of my peripheral vision, in the reflection behind where I knew I was standing, a shift. A subtle, impossible ripple, like water disturbed by an unseen stone. It wasn't my reflection, nor was it the empty chapel behind me. It was a distortion, a smudge of deeper darkness that stretched and contracted, an inky non-form that moved. It wasn't fast, not violent. It was quiet, insidious, a presence forming in the space that should have been empty. A knot of pure ice tightened in my gut. I wasn't just seeing something, I was seeing something that shouldn't exist, something that defied the very laws of optics, of reality. My breath hitched. The air around me grew heavier, thick with an unspoken word, a silent, ancient sigh. It wasn't a shadow. It was a hole in the world, momentarily visible. I screamed, or tried to. My throat was dry, constricted, releasing only a pathetic gasp. I stumbled back, my feet catching on the polished floor, the mop clattering from my numb fingers. My eyes were fixed on the mirror, but the anomaly was gone, leaving only the usual dark reflection of the empty chapel. My own panicked face stared back, a mask of abject horror. I fled, the memory seared into my retinas, the image of that impossible movement replaying in an endless loop. I told myself it was exhaustion, a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by too much coffee and too little sleep. But deep down, I knew, that was no trick, that was a glimpse. The following days were a blur of sleeplessness and paranoia. Every shadow seemed to stretch too long, every creak of the old building sounded like footsteps. I avoided the chapel, doing only the bare minimum required, my eyes darting nervously towards the heavy wooden doors. The mop handle lay discarded in the utility closet, a silent accusation. But the fear, though crippling, wasn't enough to make me quit. A new obsession had taken root, one more insidious than simple curiosity. Because that wasn't the only thing written on the mop handle. After that first night, after that first glimpse, I felt compelled to go back to search. And in the days that followed, hidden under layers of grime, faintly visible only in the right light, were more words, Maury rules. But I kept reading. I had to know. The horror I had seen was no longer a solitary incident. It was part of a larger, terrifying tapestry, hinted at by these bizarre, cryptic instructions. Each new word I painstakingly uncovered, each new rule, felt like a lock clicking shut behind me. Now I understand. I am part of the sequence, an unwitting participant in a ritual I can't comprehend, guided by these forbidden scriptures scratched into the wood by hands unseen. And the mirror, it was just the first door. I should have walked away, but the words held me captive. Now they own me. It was just another Tuesday. Another routine structural inspection of the St. Jude's Preparatory School for Boys. The kind of mundane task that pays the bills but grinds away at any notion of adventure. Built in 1888, the place always felt like it held its breath. A grand old edifice of dark brick and stained glass, far too quiet for a place of learning. The blueprints, kept in a dusty archive, were my Bible in those days, outlining every beam, every conduit, every hidden crawl space. Or so I thought. I was in the oldest wing, checking for stress fractures near the foundation, when I saw it. Tucked away in a seldom-used utility corridor, behind a stack of ancient, mouldering gym equipment, was a steel door. Not the heavy, fire-rated kind you'd expect in a public building, but something industrial almost, like a vault. There was no handle, only a thick, rusty bolt latch, and a crudely painted, faded red cross daubed on the center. It wasn't on any blueprint, not the original 1888 plans, nor any of the subsequent editions. It simply wasn't there, a phantom entrance in a building I knew like the back of my hand. My stomach tightened, a familiar prickle of unease. My training, my entire professional life, screamed anomaly. I should have walked away, should have reported it, sealed it, forgotten it. But that painted cross, so stark and out of place, gnawed at me. And then there was the key. Later that day, sorting through old hardware in the janitor's office, another part of my inspection, looking for neglected safety hazards, I found it. A keyring, heavy and forgotten, with a single, oversized, tarnished brass key unlike any other in the building. It felt warm in my palm, almost alive. When I returned to that hidden corridor, my heart thumping a frantic rhythm against my ribs, the key slid into the bolt with sickening ease. It clicked, a sound like a bone breaking in the quiet gloom. The door swung inward on hinges that screamed, revealing not a utility closet or an abandoned storage room, but a void. The air that rushed out was cold and damp, thick with the scent of old stone, dust, and something else, something acrid, like extinguished incense and fear. The steps were not modern concrete, nor the brick of the school above, but rough-hewn granite, worn smooth in the center, as if by centuries of silent descent. Each step creaked under my weight, a protest from the ancient earth. I descended, the beam of my flashlight cutting a solitary path through the oppressive darkness. Down, down, deeper than any basement should rightfully go, far beneath the lowest foundations of St. Jude. It felt like I was walking into the ground itself, into a forgotten root of the world. Space at the bottom was a chamber, circular and surprisingly vast. The air was still, heavy, and silent in a way that felt wrong, as if sound itself was absorbed before it could echo. My light danced across low, vaulted ceilings, supported by thick, unmortared stone columns. And there they were, rows of simple wooden pews, covered in a fine, grey ash. Not the ash of a fire, but something finer, colder, like the residue of countless burnt offerings. The kind of ash that coats the inside of a crematorium. And at the far end, on a rough stone altar, lay a book. It wasn't ornate or leather-bound, but a simple, thick volume with dark, unmarked covers. When I approached, the air around it shimmered faintly, and a low, resonant hum vibrated through the stone floor, up into my boots and straight into my chest. A deep, unsettling drone, like a distant, massive pipe organ playing a single, unending note. My hand trembled as I reached for it. The moment my fingers brushed the cover, the humming intensified, a pulse that shook my very bones. It felt hungry. It was a Bible, or at least it claimed to be. The Latin script was archaic, the Vulgate, but interwoven with phrases and symbols I'd never seen, not even in my cursory studies of obscure theological texts. Pages turned of their own accord, rustling like dry leaves, until it settled on a passage. Lex secunda, non pronunciabis nomen, cuius potentia non est tua. The second law, thou shalt not speak the name whose power is not yours. Below it, a litany of names, long and impossibly complex, each character twisting into itself, forming sigils that burned the page with their intensity. Names I instinctively knew for things that should not be named, things summoned, or things that summoned others. My head reeled. The hum grew louder, sharper, burrowing into my ears, bypassing them to resonate directly in my brain. The text on the page shimmered, and then, impossibly, the words lifted from the paper, like black smoke, spiraling into the air before rushing towards me. I tried to scream, but my throat was frozen. The names, the symbols, the rule, they slammed into my chest, a physical impact that knocked the breath from my lungs. A searing, unbearable heat blossomed across my skin, spreading from my chest, up my neck, into my face. It felt as if molten lead had been poured directly into my veins, twisting and burning, branding me from the inside out. My vision blurred. The darkness in the chamber seemed to press in, coalesce, forming shapes that writhed at the edges of my sight. I stumbled back, gasping, dropping the unholy book with a thud that echoed like a gunshot. I scrambled up the ancient steps, clawing my way out of that abyssal chamber, leaving the door ajar, the humming still throbbing in the air behind me. My skin felt raw, singed, though there was no mark, no scar. But I felt it in every fiber of my being. The rule was not just understood, it was known. It was part of me now. And with it, the terrifying, undeniable truth of what lay beneath St. Jude. I can still feel the echo of that hum vibrating deep within my bones, a constant reminder of the second rule, and the names I now know, the names I was never meant to possess. The dust in the library of prohibited texts settled like a fine, ancient powder on everything, a shroud over secrets best left buried. My job, simple and unforgiving, was to disturb it, to wipe away the physical evidence of neglect from centuries of forbidden knowledge. I was a ghost in the hallowed halls of the campus sancti, just another nameless hand pushing a mop. My initial impression of the students, those silent, pale figures gliding through the vaulted corridors, was one of quiet piety. They looked perpetually drained, their faces like alabaster under the flickering gaslight, a common sight in such places where academic rigor often bled into asceticism. I'd seen it before, the gauntness of those who dedicated their lives to texts, to the divine, or perhaps to something else entirely. My rules were clear. Observe nothing, speak to no one, leave no trace, just clean. But then the small things began to accumulate, like sediment in a forgotten chalice. The way their breath never misted in the chill of the unheated scriptorium, even on nights when my own lungs ached from the cold. I'd lean in, feigning a thorough sweep near a study desk, watching for the subtle rise and fall of a chest, the faint tremor of air. Nothing. Not a single wisp of vapor, not a ripple in the stillness that surrounded them. They sat, sometimes for hours, perfectly composed, their eyes fixed on texts whose titles I dared not even glimpse. I rationalized it at first. Perhaps some arcane meditative practice, a yogic control over their vital functions. Corpus et anima I'd always believed were intertwined, but these seemed disembodied in their presence. I told myself, ignoramus et ignorabimus. We don't know and we won't know. Stay out of it. The blinking was another oddity. Not random, human blinks, but a synchronized, almost ritualistic flutter of eyelids that only occurred when one of the higher-ranking priests, particularly those in the deep crimson robes, passed by. It was like a pre-programmed acknowledgement, a flicker of life triggered by a specific stimulus, not by the natural rhythm of a living being. I'd see them frozen in their seats, eyes unblinking for what felt like minutes, until the rustle of a priest's cassock reached the threshold of their peripheral vision. Then, a slow, almost mechanical blink, a collective shiver of dark lashes, and then back to the unyielding stare. It was a performance, I realized, for the benefit of their superiors. But what were they hiding beneath that fragile veneer of studious devotion? The dread began to set in, a cold, creeping sensation that my mundane work was bringing me too close to something profoundly unnatural. I should have stopped watching then, should have turned my gaze to the scuff marks on the marble and nothing else. My mop water, usually a murky grey by the end of my rounds, began to tell a different story. It was in the main refectory, where the students gathered for their silent, sparse meals. As I cleaned around their tables, carefully navigating the space they vacated, the water in my bucket took on a sinister hue. Not just dirty, but black. Deep, opaque, like ink spilled into clear water, leaving a residue of impenetrable darkness. It wasn't grime. It was as if the very air around their assigned seats, the places where their silent shoes had rested, was leaching a materia tenebrosa into the cleansing liquid. I dip the mop, watch it absorb the shadow, and wring it out, only for the next pass over the tile to draw forth more of that inky corruption. It was a physical manifestation, a silent scream of the unnatural staining the very foundations of the campus sanctity. I started to feel watched, not by the priests, but by the quiet boys themselves. Their unblinking gazes, even when directed at ancient texts, felt like they were piercing through the pages, through the walls, straight into the back of my skull. My skin crawled. The old rules, the ones whispered to me on my first day about respectful silence and minding my own business, now felt less like guidelines for a cleaner and more like an incantation, a ward to keep me from noticing. I was breaking them every night by simply seeing what was there. I felt a growing sense of complicity, as if by my very observation I was allowing this strangeness to persist, giving it credence. Then came the night in the lower catacombs, where the forgotten relics of obscure saints were kept. I was polishing a tarnished bronze plaque, the air thick with damp earth and dust. A student, one of the pale boys, was standing by a recessed archway, absolutely still, silhouetted against a distant lamp. I thought he was part of the statuary at first, or just another ghost. My heart pounded, but I pushed through the fear, trying to appear nonchalant. As I turned to leave, the silence, usually absolute in this subterranean realm, was broken. A whisper, not a rustle of cloth, not the drip of water, but a voice. Low, dry, like parchment grating against stone, and it spoke my name. My true name, not the one on my employment papers, not the one I used in the world outside these walls, but the name I had shed years ago, the name of a person I thought long buried, verbum occultum. The blood drained from my face. I spun around. The student was still there, unmoving, eyes fixed on the archway as if he hadn't spoken a sound. But I knew, I felt it in my bones. It was a recognition, a summons. In that instant, every strange observation coalesced into a single, terrifying truth. These weren't students. They weren't even truly alive. And the third rule, the one about never acknowledging the strange silence of the pupils, was never for them. It was for me. It was to keep me blind, to keep me safe from what my eyes, my curiosity, had now dragged me into. I had seen them, and now they had seen me. The echoes of that whispered name still haunt me, a chilling reminder that I am no longer an observer, but a participant, marked for some purpose I can barely comprehend. It begins insidiously, a whisper in the echoing stone, a resonance beneath the plain chant. I'm scrubbing the grime from the old marble altar, the scent of beeswax and ancient dust filling my lungs when it happens for the first time. A syllable, twisted, elongating the R in my given name, deepening the R until it vibrates through the very bones of the church. It's not just a mishearing, it's a recognition, a faint, alarming shimmer in the periphery of my awareness. I pause, the scrubbing brush still in my hand, and glance over my shoulder, but there's only Father Matthias, his back to me, meticulously polishing the chalice in the sacristy. He hums softly, an old liturgical tune, and my name, that new unname, doesn't appear to be part of his melody. I tell myself it's fatigue, the endless, grinding repetition of my days, blurring the lines between the sacred and the mundane, between sound and silence. But I keep hearing it. It's in the drone of the organ during matins, a low, sustained chord that seems to articulate the aberrant pronunciation, a sound that stretches and pulls at the fabric of the familiar. Then it bleeds into the hymns, a shadow note cast by the choir, not sung, not uttered, but implied, an unsettling harmonic ghost that only I seem to perceive. I find it scratched, crude but unmistakable, on the aged oak of a confessional booth, half hidden beneath decades of varnish and penitent sorrow. It's not just my name. It's that name, the one that makes my skin prickle with cold. I thought I was imagining it, a trick of the mind, a symptom of the quiet madness that sometimes blossoms in isolated devotion. But then there's Father Alonso, his usually placid face etched with a fear that stops my heart. He pulls me aside after Vespers, his hand a surprisingly firm grip on my arm. We are in the dim, cool corridor leading to the scriptorium, a place I'm usually forbidden from entering. His eyes, usually clouded with scholarly distance, are sharp, piercing. "My son," he begins, his voice barely a whisper, "who taught you the true pronunciation of your name?" My mind scrambles, blank. True pronunciation. I stammer, confused, denying I even know such a thing. He studies me, his gaze unsettlingly deep, as if searching for something buried within my very soul. "The nomen verum," he clarifies, the Latin word sounding ancient and heavy on his tongue. "The one they speak." He looks terrified, a genuine, profound terror that chills me to the bone, and when I can only offer a blank, uncomprehending stare, his grip tightens. He says nothing more, only shakes his head, a gesture of profound resignation, and shuffles away, leaving me alone with the sudden, crushing weight of his fear. It confirms it, you see. It wasn't my imagination. I've seen the rules etched into things before, fragments of ancient knowledge scattered like breadcrumbs in this vast, secretive institution. There's the Latin phrase carved above the old well, aquam bibat ex siti, or the faded warning on the refectory wall, ni liquaris nisa interrogatus. But it's the one on my bucket that twists my gut now. The heavy wooden bucket, scarred by years of scrubbing consecrated floors, the metal bands tarnished almost black. Scratched into the inner lip, crude but deliberate, are the words, "Noli respondia cum chorus te vocat." Do not respond when the choir calls you. A rule so specific, so utterly out of place on a cleaning implement. Who put it there? When and why? I'd always dismissed it as a cryptic jest from some long-dead monk, a reminder of the silence we cultivate. Now Father Alonso's fear, the nomen verum, and the omnipresent echo of my twisted name coalesce into a single, horrifying truth. Because I had already answered. It happened during Compline, late at night, the air thick with incense and the sleepy murmur of prayers. The choir, a solemn, earthly sound, lifted their voices. But beneath it, beyond it, transcending it, was the other sound. Not a voice from the living, but a chorus from somewhere vast and cold, a multitude of whispers coalescing into a single, resonant call. And that call, that terrible, beautiful, irresistible call, was my name. Not the one my parents gave me, but the nomen verum, perfectly articulated, each syllable a hook sinking into my core. I felt a surge of something: recognition, obligation. And without thinking, without even a flicker of conscious choice, a sound escaped my lips, a soft, involuntary sigh that was, undeniably, an acknowledgement, a surrender, a response. I was never meant to know it, this true pronunciation. It's knowledge from the deep, buried vaults, from the codices that speak of binding and unbinding, of names as keys to other places, other entities. I feel it now, a shifting within me, as if a part of my soul has been tagged, designated, pulled taut on an invisible thread. The old texts hint at these things, these Vatican conspiracies that reach back into the true Dark Ages, about certain lines, certain individuals whose names are not merely identifiers but invitations, summoning sigils. I've become one of them, haven't I? The paranoia is no longer psychological breakdown, it's a grim reality. My name isn't mine anymore. It belongs to the call. And now I wait. The chapel, even in the dim light of dawn, always felt like a bruise on the landscape. Not overtly sinister, but with an underlying thrum of something profoundly wrong. It wasn't consecrated ground in the traditional sense, more like an anchor for a deeper, older blasphemy. I'd walked past the altar 100 times, my gaze invariably drawn to the great, iron-bound Bible that rested upon it, held in place by chains so thick they looked less like restraints and more like permanent fixtures of its being. An ancient, ornate thing, its leather cover cracked with centuries of silence, its brass clasp sealed tight. Every instinct screamed, "Leave it be." Every fiber of my being, every cell that still clung to the vestiges of my former, unburdened self, urged me away. But there's a reason they say curiosity killed the cat. In my case, it didn't kill me outright. It simply opened the door to a much, much worse fate. I remember the chill, a sudden, inexplicable drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the drafty stone. It was a cold that bit at the marrow, a warning I foolishly dismissed as the usual chapel gloom. I stood before the altar, the air thick with dust motes dancing in the faint light filtering through the grimy lancet windows, and reached out. My fingers, as if guided by an unseen hand, traced the heavy, rusted links of the chain. They felt less like metal and more like living sinews. Clasps, despite their age, yielded with an unnerving ease. A soft click, almost a sigh, echoed in the silence. The weight of the book was immense, humming beneath my fingertips with something ancient. And when I opened it, the page it fell upon wasn't random. No, it was waiting. There on brittle, yellowed parchment, written in an elegant, spidery hand, was my own script. My loops, my cross-strokes, my characteristic way of forming ins. But the ink was a faded sepia I had never owned, and the words. The words were utterly alien, a Latin I recognized, but twisted, arcane, dripping with venomous intent. A shiver, colder than any before, snaked its way down my spine. This wasn't a historical artifact, this was a personal violation. My handwriting, words I had never pennied. A dark premonition gripped me. I should have slammed it shut, run, and never looked back. But the words, even unread, pulsed with an irresistible gravity, compelling me to give them voice. So I did. My throat felt dry, my voice a whisper at first, then gaining an unnatural resonance as I uttered the first phrases. De profundis tenebris, de silentias abyssi, from the depths of darkness. From the silences of the abyss, the air grew heavy, pressing down, stealing my breath. The single electric bulb above the altar flickered violently, then plunged the chapel into an absolute, suffocating darkness. And then I heard it. A low, guttural chuckle, utterly devoid of humor, scraping against reality. It was a laugh not human, and it spoke, not with words, but with an inflection that was unmistakably Latin. Mocking, triumphant, quis est qui invocat me? Who is it who calls upon me? That laugh, that question, was my final, unambiguous warning. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the encroaching void. Fear, raw and primal, screamed at me to stop. But the dread was mixed with a terrifying fascination, a perverse need to understand what I had stumbled upon. The words, unseen in the gloom, burned into my mind, illuminated by some internal, desperate light, and I kept reading. My voice, now barely my own, continued, compelled by a force beyond my will. Nomen obscurum, peritus solis nigri verbum demonis auditum est. The obscure name, through the rite of the black sun, the word of the demon is heard. Each syllable felt like a key turning in a lock, unlocking not just secrets, but realities. The shadows in the chapel began to twist, to writhe, taking on impossible forms, coalescing into outlines that weren't quite solid, yet utterly present. A sickeningly sweet, metallic scent filled the air, like old blood mixed with ozone. My mind fragmented, pieces of my sanity peeling away like old paint. I was no longer just reading, I was performing. The words were not descriptive, they were creative, actively reshaping the world around me and within me. I was a conduit, a tool, my voice merely a vessel for something ancient and hungry. This wasn't merely a text, it was a ritual, and I, the unwitting celebrant. The last phrase dissolved into a profound, pervasive silence. The world shifted irrevocably. I was no longer alone. The Bible had answered me back, not with words, but with a binding. I had opened the door and something had stepped through, leaving its mark on the very essence of my being. Vobiscum est. It is with you. And now, every shadow I pass feels like a hungry gaze. Every silence a promise of what waits just beyond the veil I so carelessly tore. I remember the first time I heard it. A deep, resonant thrumming, like a colossal beast stirring in its sleep. It emanated from the ancient, sealed-off wing of the Vatican archives, a section so decrepit and water-damaged it had been declared structurally unsound decades ago. I was working late, cataloguing some particularly esoteric Gnostic texts, a minor heresy, largely forgotten, fascinating for its divergent cosmology, but ultimately harmless. Or so I thought. The groaning, I rationalized, was the building itself, the ancient lead pipes shuddering under pressure, the immense weight of the Roman bedrock shifting beneath us. It was a comforting, if mundane, explanation. I was a scholar, you see, a man of logic and reason. I sought order in chaos, and I believed the world, even its most obscure corners, ultimately conformed to natural law. What a fool I was. It started subtly. Not the groaning, but the priests. Old Father Ignatius, his face a roadmap of ancient sins and forgotten penances, and the younger brother Alaric, whose eyes always seemed too wide, too haunted for a man of God. Their visits to the sealed wing were sporadic at first, then became a weekly ritual. Always after Compline, when the last gasps of daylight bled from the stained glass windows and the corridors grew long with shadow. They carried covered baskets, sometimes a heavy burlap sack, and once I distinctively heard the clinking of glass jars within. Their movements were furtive, hushed, too careful for men merely conducting maintenance or securing a forgotten relic. They would disappear into a side corridor, one I knew led only to a dead end, a collapsed stairwell, or so the maps claimed. My academic curiosity, which I now recognize as a terminal disease of the spirit, began to fester. The pipes didn't just groan, they throbbed on those nights, a pulse that seemed to mirror my own quickening heartbeat. I started watching them, a shameful surveillance that gnawed at my conscience even as it fed my growing dread. From the vantage point of a dust-choked mezzanine, hidden behind stacks of forgotten papal bulls, I saw it. One night Father Ignatius, his arthritic fingers trembling, fumbled with a loose section of mortar in the wall, revealing not a void but a dark, gaping crack. He then, with a reverence that turned my stomach cold, slid through a package wrapped in oilcloth. A metallic tang, unmistakable, drifted upwards. Blood, raw meat, not bread and wine, but flesh and gore. They weren't preserving history, they were feeding something. I should have stopped then. I should have reported it, walked away, buried myself in the safety of my harmless heresies. But the sight of those offerings, the sheer, primal wrongness of it in the heart of the Vatican, had become a hook in my mind. The groaning ceased to be the building. It was the hunger, a vast, patient hunger emanating from within the very fabric of the Holy See. It called to me, promising answers, demanding witness. And one night I answered. The air in that dead-end corridor was thick and cold, even in high summer. It smelled of damp earth, old stone, and something else, something sickly sweet, like decay mixed with ozone. The faint, persistent thrumming pulled me forward, a siren song of revelation. I found the crack just as they had. It was perfectly disguised, blending with the ancient, crumbling stonework. But once I knew it was there, it stood out like a fresh wound. With trembling hands, I pried at the loose mortar, just enough to create a small aperture barely wide enough to peer through. My breath hitched in my throat, a dry, choked gasp. Inside, it wasn't a chamber, not a cavern, but an immeasurable space. The darkness was not absolute. It was a living, breathing thing, punctuated by glints of something wet and ancient. And then they opened. Dozens, hundreds of eyes. Not human eyes, not animal eyes. They were multifaceted, iridescent, like the eyes of some abyssal creature, yet they shimmered within the very mortar, emerging from the stone, retracting back into it. They pulsed with an ancient, malevolent intelligence, fixated on my single, peering eye. And then, slowly, a movement. A ripple in the darkness, and a long, greyish-pink tongue, glistening with something viscous, snaked out from the shifting depths. It was broad, flat, and impossibly long. It didn't reach for the offerings the priests had left. It reached for me. It moved with the terrifying deliberation of a predator, its tip a barbed, unsettling structure that brushed against the cracked wall, then slid through the narrow opening I had made. Before I could react, before my fear could translate into flight, it was there, pressing against my temple, its surface rough and cold. Then it slid down, brushing against my ear. And it licked. Not a gentle lick, but a deep, probing touch, as if it sought to taste my very thoughts. And in that awful, wet contact, the rule entered me. It wasn't a word, not a phrase, but a fundamental truth, a cosmic principle of profound, horrifying simplicity. A set of instructions, an understanding of the true nature of things, whispered directly into my consciousness by something that predated human language, predated the church, perhaps even predated time. It was the knowledge of what they were feeding, why they were feeding it, and what it truly was. And in that instant I knew. I knew the Vatican was built not on rock, but on the living, dreaming flesh of something unspeakable, placated by blood and adoration. I knew the groaning was not the building, but the muffled cries of the world itself, caught in the grip of an ancient, hungry parasite. I knew its name, though I could never utter it without unmaking myself. And the most terrifying part, the rule was not an external decree. It was an internal compulsion. I am not free of it. I never will be. The rule is inside me now. It dictates my every thought, every agonizing breath. I hear its constant hum beneath the surface of the world. It showed me the truth, and for that I am eternally damned. The rule whispers, and I am compelled to listen. I used to believe that the true horror of the Vatican archives lay in the forbidden knowledge they contained, the heretical texts, the suppressed histories that would shatter the bedrock of faith. My early research, my meticulous cataloguing of esoteric rituals and apocryphal gospels felt like a dangerous game, but one played from a safe, academic distance. I was a scholar, a careful custodian of the unholy, merely observing the shadows cast by ancient dogma. I should have stopped when the footnotes began to reference unindexed appendices, when the dates on the ledgers stretched further back than official church records allowed, detailing not texts, but transfers. But I kept reading, driven by that relentless academic curiosity, that insidious need to connect every single unsettling dot. I thought I was simply uncovering a deeper, more brutal aspect of priestly training, perhaps a kind of black ops division for dealing with the truly intractable cases of possession, a necessary evil within the greater good. The annex wasn't on any map, not the modern ones, nor even the older blueprints I'd managed to procure through unconventional means. It was an afterthought, a cancerous growth appended to the oldest wing of the seminary, hidden behind a false wall in what was officially designated a disused boiler room. The air in that hidden corridor was different from the moment I breached the brickwork. It was still, heavy, tasting faintly of ozone and old, stagnant grief. A deep, pervasive cold seeped into my bones, a kind of cold that no amount of ambient temperature could explain, a cold that felt like it came from within the stone itself, a residue of something profoundly unnatural. The records I'd found, cryptic and coded, spoke of incompletes, unresolved presences, and stabilized infestations. The phrase hostia non perfecta appeared with chilling regularity, not in reference to the Eucharist, but to human beings, living vessels deemed unworthy of either liberation or final dissolution. The corridor opened into a series of rooms, each more desolate than the last. The initial ones were mere storage, containing discarded liturgical items, rusted censers, moth-eaten vestments, vials of holy water long evaporated. But then I found it, a classroom. It was unmistakably a classroom, yet utterly wrong. 20 small wooden desks, the kind for young children, were bolted to the floor with heavy iron chains, each desk chair unit secured by additional restraints that looked like they belonged in a prison cell. The blackboard at the front bore faded chalk marks, unintelligible scribbles that resembled no language I knew, yet pulsed with an unsettling energy, a faint, almost subliminal hum that made my teeth ache. The air here was potent, thick with the metallic tang of old blood, the acrid bite of sulfur, and an underlying stench that was undeniably, horrifyingly, of decaying teeth and stagnant breath. It was a charnel house masquerading as a schoolroom. This was not where priests were trained. It was where the consequences of their failures were kept. I moved slowly, each step echoing too loudly in the suffocating quiet. The silence wasn't empty. It was pregnant with 1,000 unspoken torments, a chorus of muted screams and suppressed convulsions. I traced a finger along one of the chained desks, feeling the cold, rough wood, the serrated edge of a scratch mark on its surface. It was then, as my senses were overwhelmed by the sheer, unspeakable wrongness of the place, that I heard it. A faint scraping from the far corner of the room, a sound like fingernails dragging across stone, followed by a low, guttural exhalation. I froze, my heart seizing in my chest, a primal dread seizing me unlike anything I had ever known. I thought I was alone, thought these were just relics, grim monuments to suffering. But they weren't. From the deepest shadow, a figure stirred. It was impossibly gaunt, skeletal even, shrouded in tattered, indeterminate fabric that might once have been a child's smock. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and though I couldn't discern features in the gloom, I felt the weight of its gaze, ancient and burning. It didn't move towards me, but merely shifted, a slow, agonizing effort, as if every joint were rusted shut. And then it spoke, a voice like pebbles rattling in a dry well, ancient and raspy, yet perfectly clear, perfectly articulate. "Brother," it hissed, the single word cutting through the putrid air, a sound of recognition, of perverse kinship. It was an invitation, a claim, a terrifying welcome. My hand, already slick with nervous sweat, lost its grip. The heavy brass keys, the ones that had opened the door to this unthinkable place, clattered to the floor, vanishing into the deep shadow beneath the chained desk nearest me, a darkness I suddenly feared to reach into. I heard the faint jingle as they hit the floor, then nothing. Silence descended once more, but now it was a silence that held my name. I didn't try to retrieve them. I couldn't. The word, brother, echoed in the bone marrow, asserting a connection I had never sought, a membership I never wanted. They knew me. Whatever they were, whatever unspeakable things dwelled in the confines of that chained classroom, they had seen me, marked me, named me. I stumbled backward, the scent of sulfur and teeth suddenly overwhelming, gagging me. My academic distance had dissolved, utterly annihilated by that single, raspy word. I wasn't an observer anymore. I was part of the collection, an item now bound to the unspeakable secrets I had uncovered. I am still just brother to them, and I feel their eyes on me even now. It started subtly, as these things always do, with a whisper that sounds like reason. I was so consumed by the Liber Tenebris, the so-called Book of Shadows, I'd painstakingly reconstructed from fragments spirited out of a forgotten Vatican subarchive. My initial intention was pure, or so I told myself, to understand, to catalogue, to demystify the insidious power of the ancient rituals it detailed, the forbidden names, the summoning sigils that promised a direct conduit to. Well, to what, precisely? I should have stopped when the ink on the ancient vellum seemed to shift under my very gaze, shimmering with an unnatural iridescence. I should have recognized the danger when the warnings, scrawled in marginalia by some long-dead, terrified scholar, became less about the external entities and more about the reader's soul. But I kept reading, driven by that academic arrogance, that insatiable hunger for knowledge, deemed too dangerous for mortal men. I thought I was simply deciphering the arcane. Instead, I was unlocking a cage and walking straight inside. The first marks appeared almost innocently, faint discolorations across my rib cage, stretching over the soft flesh of my upper abdomen. I dismissed them, of course. Sleepless nights poring over the Codex Veridicus, the intense mental strain of correlating archaic Greek with fragmented Latin incantations, it all led to exhaustion. Bruises, I reasoned, from leaning against my desk, or perhaps a minor dietary deficiency. They were a dull, almost purplish hue at first, like old coffee stains on canvas, barely noticeable unless I angled myself just so in the mirror. I'd press a finger to them, feeling a slight, uncharacteristic warmth beneath the skin, a faint throb that wasn't quite pain, but more a dull, insistent hum. It was nothing, a temporary anomaly, my body protesting the rigorous demands of my scholarly pursuit. I was wrong, of course. So terribly, terribly wrong. The hum intensified, a low vibration that seemed to resonate deep within my bones, a counterpoint to the frantic beating of my heart. Then, the transformation began in earnest. I remember the exact moment. I was translating a particularly obscure passage, one detailing the prima regula, the first rule, a strict injunction against revealing the true nature of the summoned entity. As my finger traced the Latin text on the page, a sharp, searing line of agony bloomed across my chest. I gasped, tearing my shirt open, my breath catching in my throat. Where mere hours before there had been only vague discoloration, now there was a thin, angry crimson line, fresh and raw like a superficial cut. And then, as I stared, horrified, the line branched, then another, until words began to materialize. Not merely impressions, but actual, perfectly formed letters, deeply etched into my flesh, as if carved by an unseen, incandescent hand. The first legible phrase was sickeningly familiar: non revelabis nomen. Do not reveal the name. The first rule, indeed. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. The rules weren't contained within the decaying pages of the Liber Tenebris anymore. They were inside me. They were writing themselves upon me. Each subsequent mark was born not from my study, but from my transgressions. A moment of doubt, a whispered question to a trusted colleague, a fleeting thought of abandoning my research. Each nascent act of defiance brought with it a fresh incision, a new line bleeding across my skin. The initial faint bruises had hardened, the words now like raised scars, permanent monuments to my escalating failures. I was a living palimpsest, my body becoming the very text I sought to understand, each infraction etching a deeper, more painful truth. Tu es vas, read one new line just below my collarbone. You are the vessel. Tu es lex. You are the law. It wasn't just a punishment. It was an insidious, irreversible transformation. My world has shrunk to the four walls of my study, the faint light of my lamp illuminating both the accursed book and the increasingly intricate script sprawling across my chest. Sleep offers no respite, only vivid nightmares of invisible chisels and boiling ink, of a formless presence watching me from the periphery of my vision, waiting for my next misstep. This isn't just about breaking ancient laws. It's about becoming them, a living embodiment of the lex profana. The Vatican archives, the forbidden knowledge I so eagerly devoured, were not just guarding secrets, but containing a contagion. And I, in my blind ambition, uncorked it. I am no longer merely a scholar. I am a walking, breathing codex, inscribed with the very rules I sought to comprehend. The dread is constant now, a suffocating blanket of knowing that my flesh is merely borrowed space, a canvas for an unspeakable, eternal decree. I thought I was deciphering the narrative of an ancient evil. Instead, I've become its next chapter. The lines keep writing themselves, even when I am silent, even when I try not to think, growing ever closer to my heart. The metallic tang still coats my tongue, a phantom taste that no amount of scrubbing can dislodge. Dawn was a brutal grey smear across the chapel's stained glass, its holy figures seeming to recoil from the sight of me. My cassock, discarded in a heap, was soaked through, but it was the shirt beneath, the one I hadn't even realized I was wearing until I pulled it off, that truly chilled me. There, etched in my own blood, were the sigils, The words. Not scrawled, not written, but formed, as if the very fibers of the cotton had twisted themselves into the grotesque script I had unearthed from the forbidden codex, the one hidden in the deepest catacombs beneath the Vatican archives. I remember thinking, quite lucidly, that I should have stopped when the ink started to burn my fingertips, when the words themselves began to hum. But I kept reading, didn't I? I thought I was simply transcribing, preserving. I was wrong. I was hunched over the marble altar, desperately trying to scour away the residual crimson, the blood that wasn't mine, not entirely, when the headmaster entered. He moved with a silent, heavy grace, his shadow stretching long and distorted in the weak light. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs, convinced he would demand an explanation, unleash his righteous fury. But he didn't. He merely observed, his gaze lingering on the bloodied cloth clutched in my trembling hand, on the dark, damp stains that clung to the chapel floor. There was no shock in his eyes, no anger, only an ancient, unsettling recognition, as if he had always known this moment would arrive. His face, usually a canvas of severe piety, held a terrible, quiet satisfaction. "It chose you," he stated, his voice a low, resonant murmur that seemed to vibrate through the very stone of the chapel. He said it not as a question, nor even an accusation, but as a simple, undeniable fact, a pronouncement from an oracle. He walked past me, his robes brushing my shoulder, a touch that felt colder than ice, and knelt before the altar I had just defiled. He began to pray, a litany in a guttural, archaic Latin that sent shivers down my spine, words I recognized from the most sequestered, cross-referenced appendices of the Liber Maleficarum, the very book I had sworn to guard from discovery. It was then I understood. He wasn't ignorant, he was complicit. He had been waiting. The rest of the day was a blur of chilling observations. The other priests, usually prone to idle chatter and gentle reprimands, averted their gazes as I passed. Their eyes, when they occasionally flickered my way, were wide with a fear I now understood to be not for themselves, but for me, for what I had become. The younger novices, the children who usually clamored for my attention, now moved away, their bright faces shadowed with an inexplicable awe. They didn't run. They bowed, small, uncertain genuflections as I walked by, as if I were some newly consecrated, terrifying saint. Each bow was a fresh rivet hammered into the invisible chains that now bound me to this place, to this terrible new identity. That night, as the chapel bell tolled its customary 9 chimes, a new inscription appeared on the stone archway above the main entrance, shimmering into existence with an unholy light. Not carved, not painted, but manifested, like the words on my shirt. Non relinquas, do not leave. It wasn't a suggestion or a commandment from an unseen superior. It was absolute. The rule isn't just a decree anymore. It's a palpable presence, an unyielding force woven into the very fabric of the building, into the silence of the corridors, the chill of the stones. The rule is the house now, and I am its central, captive pulse. But even as the dread settled deep into my bones, even as the house itself seemed to breathe around me with possessive intent, a desperate, rebellious spark ignited. I had already started planning my escape. Every shadow now holds a secret, every whispered prayer a subtle warning. I thought I had escaped, walked out of those echoing halls and back into the familiar, if stark, comfort of my own home. But the school, it seems, clung to me, woven into the very fabric of my perception. The first sign, a subtle aberration I dismissed as exhaustion, was in the bathroom mirror. My reflection, once instantaneous, now seemed to arrive a beat late, a slight, almost imperceptible delay, as if the image had to travel a greater distance than light allowed. In that brief, disorienting lag, I would sometimes catch a glimpse not of my own bathroom, but of the chapel's shadowed nave, its cold stone arches looming behind my own bewildered face, accompanied by a low, sibilant murmur like wind through forgotten crypts. I should have stopped then, should have turned away and sought help. But the scholar in me, the insatiable hunger for truth, demanded I observe, analyze. The anomalies escalated, shedding their ambiguity. Pine needles, despite no pine trees being within 100 yards of my house, began to appear on my polished floorboards, not scattered haphazardly, but arranged with a chilling precision, forming intricate, looping patterns that resolved, under closer scrutiny, into fragments of Latin. Perditio ventura est, one such cluster declared, stark against the dark wood, translating to destruction is coming. Another, more insidious, was a name I recognized from the forbidden codices I'd only glimpsed, a name never to be spoken, much less written. My old leather-bound Bible, a lifelong anchor, now thrummed with a low, disquieting vibration when I touched it, as if a trapped bee were buzzing deep within its aged pages, its sacred verses now humming a melody utterly profane. I thought I was imagining it until my hand, shaking, felt the distinct warmth emanating from the worn cover, a heat that was not natural, not benign. The knowledge I had uncovered at the school was not just theoretical. It was a living, breathing entity, attaching itself to me like a parasite. I had delved into the hushed whispers of forgotten Vatican archives, into apocryphal texts meticulously hidden from the common eye, revealing ritualistic practices designed not to worship, but to contain, or perhaps to invoke, entities of unimaginable antiquity. The names I'd committed to memory, the geometric sigils I'd sketched in clandestine notebooks, they weren't just symbols. They were keys, opening doors that should forever remain sealed. I had dismissed the warnings, the chilling prefaces in archaic languages, the faded annotations screaming of unclean hands. But I kept reading, driven by a perverse fascination, convinced I was merely documenting history, not inviting it into my very soul. Sleep became a torment, a shallow abyss filled with distorted visions of stained glass saints, weeping blood and shadows that danced with an impossible, skeletal grace. I saw them in the periphery of my vision, at the edge of the mirrors, just outside the radius of my lamp. The whispers grew louder, clearer, no longer just the chapel's voice, but a chorus, a discordant symphony of ancient tongues vying for my attention. My own thoughts felt porous, as if they were no longer truly my own, but being filtered through another, older consciousness. My reflection in the glass began to move independently, a slight twitch of the lips, a flicker in the eyes that wasn't mine, a prelude to a complete usurpation of self. It was a psychological breakdown, yes, but one orchestrated by an intelligence far beyond human comprehension. Then last night it happened. I was standing in the quiet of my living room, the moonlight casting long, accusing fingers across the floor, when a profound silence descended, a pressure that squeezed the air from my lungs. And then, from deep within my own throat, a voice emerged. It wasn't my voice. It was deeper, resonant with an age that defied millennia, yet it spoke with my cadence, my inflection. "Do not tell them what you saw," it commanded, each syllable a hammer blow against my fragile sanity. It was the final rule, the ultimate covenant, whispered from the very vessel it now occupied. A prohibition, absolute and terrifying, that sealed my fate. The chilling realization that the knowledge wasn't just with me, it was within me, a silent passenger now declaring its dominion. And yet here I am, recounting it all, telling you. Why? A primal scream against the encroaching darkness, perhaps. A desperate, futile act of defiance against a decree I know, with every fiber of my being, carries an irreversible penalty. The words tumble out, forced by an impulse I can no longer suppress, a final, defiant act of sovereignty over my own mind, even as I feel it slipping away. The air in the room is growing colder, dense with an expectant presence. The hum from the Bible has escalated to a palpable tremor, and the mirrors around the house now show only the inky blackness of a bottomless void, reflecting nothing. I hear the subtle shift of pine needles on the floor, rearranging themselves once more. This isn't just a confession, it's a testament, a final declaration before the silence consumes me. I can feel the edges of the morning light, but I don't think I'll survive to greet it. The very act of speaking has irrevocably shattered the last fragile barrier. They are already here. If you're still here, maybe the darkness hasn't claimed you yet, but it listens. It always listens. Before you leave this story behind, leave a mark of your own. Subscribe so you don't wander these halls alone. Like this video if you dare to hear more confessions like mine. And tell me in the comments, what rule would you never break, even in the dark? Lights low, volume high. The next story is already waiting for you.